The Titanic, the mass murder that created the Federal Reserve Bank and the New World Order's 20th century. On tonight's Bob Tuskin show, we'll take a look at the Titanic. We've seen a few stories that just happened to be in the news today. We had been planning this show for a couple weeks now and had no idea that it would be on the very day that, according to Reuters, the acclaimed Hollywood epic film Titanic will hit the movie theaters worldwide in a 3D version next year. Hollywood Studios and its director, James Cameron, said today. And let's take a look at the other story that happened to be in the news today in regards to the Titanic. This is from the Daily Mail. One Titanic price tag, unique diagram of sunken liner used at official inquiry to be sold at auction. There is a 32-foot-long plan on the Doom ship, according to this article. And we'll get into that throughout the show tonight. And it's sold at auction for 150,000 quid, which is the equivalent of $200,000. The extraordinary plan was used by, witnesses and experts to establish the cause of the tragedy, and even contains original chalk marks showing what happened. Pretty interesting stuff, considering that when we take a look at what happened, we see that there was more to the story. Was the Titanic a death trap designed to murder billionaires like John Jacob Astor and withstood J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller's plan for the Federal Reserve banking system, now robbing the entire world while financing international wars? Before you discuss this as a, quote, conspiracy theory, you might want to read the book Futility, The Wreck of the Titan, published in 1893, that we'll tell you tonight about and how that connects to all this, which predicted the events in almost exact detail 14 years before it happened. But that's just a coincidence, right? The novel is about a ship called the Titan, the largest ocean liner in the world that sinks in the North Atlantic after hitting an ice shelf virtually identical to the Titanic disaster. How were they able to foreshadow this so identically to the story 14 years before it happened? James Cameron's blockbuster hit The Titanic presents a sympathetic view of the disaster, which portrays a grandfatherly Captain Edward J. Smith. But there are very good reasons to blame him for the deliberately sinking of the Titanic, for deliberately sinking of the Titanic as a psychopathic disciple of the Jesuit Freemason agenda for the world domination of the Federal Reserve banking system and this Jesuit order. In light of the evidence, it makes far more sense than the flimsy explanations of what the Titanic was lost to mishaps and accidents. We'll talk about that in just a moment. This is Bob Tuskin. You know, this isn't the world's most important story right now. We're working on a few things behind the scenes, but it's something that we had planned, and it does relate to the core of corruption, to the core of the powers that shouldn't be. So we need to look at history and learn from history, and of course, his story is what they're trying to get the brainwashed masses to believe, and of course, there's more to most everything that we come across that we may have taken for granted that the mainstream told us, whether it's Pearl Harbor, the sinking of the Lusitania, Titanic, all of these things. I really don't know what's what anymore. 10 years ago I would have said it was crazy to look into, what the Holocaust means. And, today I'm open to looking at how it was used as a propaganda campaign, just like a lot of these events have. And I come from a Jewish family, so you can't accuse me, of course, of being anti-Semitic. Joining us on the show tonight, two very great correspondents on this issue. They've been looking into this and working extremely hard to bring you tonight's show. We'll start off with our good friend Popeye of FederalJack.com. Popeye, welcome to the show.
Hello, Bob.
Hi. We got a lot to talk about, so I want to jump right into it. And Steve Stars will also be joining us tonight, and he's wrote a great article that we will link up to the site, and we will get this out. And again, this isn't the most important of topics. Yes, we should be talking about solutions and preparedness, but, you know, I think we need to learn from this, right, Popeye? I mean, it's something we need to look into.
Look, history is going to repeat itself over and over and over again until people understand that these very same elitist schmucks that are in charge today are the same people that were responsible for things like the Titanic disaster, okay? And it's important to know that, because without understanding a history of your enemy, you won't know who you're fighting against, and you won't be prepared at all. So if you really want to be prepared, okay, not only do you need to know, a little bit about investing in gold and silver and, permaculture and growing your own food and understanding who the Federal Reserve is, but you also have to be privy to all of their crimes so that you know exactly the level of the enemy that you're dealing with. Otherwise, there's no point in trying to fight the battle, because you're not going to win it.
Mm-hmm.
History is important, and it's important to understand that the events that happened on the Titanic, the three of the major people that died on the Titanic, would have opposed the Federal Reserve System.
How do we know this? Let's start with this. Let's name the people. I'm sure a lot of our listeners are already familiar with the fact that these individuals were on the ship, but let's name them. Let's talk about who they were. Let's start with that, and then let's look at how there's evidence that shows that they were standing between the Federal Reserve and the American public and the world, for that matter.
Well, first off, this is all, 1910, you had the Jekyll Island meeting, on Jekyll Island, Georgia, and you had, like, J.P. Morgan and Rockefellers, and actually they didn't. Most of those people didn't go themselves. They had people that were, like Nelson Aldrich and Frank Vanderlip and a few other people that actually sat and represented their empire, as it were, like people like J.P. Morgan and stuff. But they were trying to create the Federal Reserve, and as a way of, this is a prime example of showing how they eat their own, Bob. If it's not about the fact, and Astor, the Astor family, that's the Vanderbilt fortune.
And they were on the ship.
Yes, Jacob Astor was, but he's part of his blood lineage goes back, to part of the same black nobility families. So it's not like it's not like he's not one of them. It's just when one of their own stands in the way of something that they are going to do, off they go. Because he was you could consider him to be the world's richest man at the time.
Right, because I was going to say, what makes him any different than the other power structures?
He was richer than any of them.
Yeah, but if he was richer than anyone, that should tell me he was more evil than any of them. Not necessarily that, wealth equals...
Well, he wasn't Astor understood, he was younger, he wasn't an older guy, like you would think. He wasn't like one of these 60 or 70-year-old rich elites. He was younger, and he didn't really inherit, the business qualities that his father had, okay? So he was of a different generation, and that happens. And I'm not saying that Astor stood up and said no to the Fed. He never even got a chance to stand up and try to fight it, through Congress or through people that would represent him, like he could back people monetarily that would, be in Congress that could fight against it. None of this. There was never a threat of any push to stop the Federal Reserve, because these guys were taken out. If you take out three of the most powerful men in the world, okay, that could, they personally would get screwed by the Federal Reserve. Think about it. These guys combined were worth $500 million before the formation of the Fed. So in today's standards, that would be somewhere, well, I mean, now our dollar's really screwed, so probably even worth more, but, with inflation. But we'll say like between 11 and $12 billion these guys were worth. Now, as a nation, we've spent way more than that, but that's a lot of money. $500 million before the Federal Reserve was created and the value of the dollar was destroyed, or the value of the purchasing value of the currency of the nation was destroyed. Because if you remember, the value of bread, the cost of a loaf of bread didn't go down, didn't go up for over 100 years. And then the Fed came into power and everything started going up because of inflation. These guys would have lost their fortunes. They would have lost, you know what I mean? They wouldn't have stood to gain from this. They would have been destroyed. As a result, a lot of their fortunes ended up being corrupted and taken over by people like J.P. Morgan, and their money ended up funding a new world order anyway. And now, of course, the Vanderbilt family, they fall in line. Look at Anderson Cooper. He's really a Vanderbilt.
He's related, huh?
So, I mean, and I'm sure that, we've discussed this off air many times. There's always infighting amongst these elites. And if one person threatens to stand in their way and say, hey, maybe that's a bad idea, maybe we should do this. Because remember, the Federal Reserve is nothing but a bunch of private crooks. And J.P. Morgan ended up eating up a lot of the Isidore Straus's money. A lot of that stuff ended up getting eaten up by J.P. Morgan. So that just made J.P. Morgan a lot richer and more powerful. And J.P. Morgan just happens to be the biggest owner and shareholder in the Federal Reserve banking system.
Ah, interesting. All right. Well, we'll discover a little bit more about some of the players involved, and we'll also talk about the Jesuit connection to this whole thing when we have Steve Stars come on the line. And then we'll tell you about the similarities between the Titanic and the Titan. Something absolutely mind-boggling. There's too many coincidences for me to believe that they're merely coincidences. All right, folks. This is the Bob Tuskin Show with a special of let me see if I can say this right. A special of Titanic proportions on the Titanic. The Titanic, the mass murder that created the Federal Reserve Bank and the New World Order's 20th century. This is the Bob Tuskin Show, a special on the Titanic of Titanic proportions. Along with Popeye from FederalJack.com, we're now joined with Steve Stars. And Steve, I'll ask the same question that I asked Popeye, and then at some point throughout the show tonight, we're going to get into a couple things: the Jesuit connection and the strange similarities between the Titan and the Titanic. But let me ask you, there was these certain individuals, right, on the ship. A lot of our listeners have heard this already. And it seems like they were taken out on purpose. Now, one of the things we heard from the mainstream account of what happened on the Titanic was that the rich, that they had left first, and that the poor people were left behind because the rich, according to the official story, left first. Two questions.
Yeah.
Why was it that these rich were taken out? And what was it about them that posed a threat? What was the evidence that showed that these guys weren't just any old bankers like the ones we face today that are in control?
Okay, those are good questions, and there's always been a lot of concern as to say, well, how did they, let's put it this way. Astor and Guggenheim didn't have any interest in the Jekyll Island meetings. Obviously. I mean, they weren't involved with Aldrich, with the Rockefeller funding people, J.P. Morgan's representatives, Warburg, and people like that. They weren't in the loop. And there were good reasons for that. Astor was probably the richest man in the world at that time. John Jacob Astor IV, I guess it was. He had quite a bit of money. Guggenheim also was rather wealthy as well. Both of these guys were entrepreneurs and businessmen in their own right. They weren't just wealthy financiers. They were inventors. They were backing people like Tesla. We can get into that a little bit later on. But I think your question is, when you say that the rich weren't taken out first, you mean on the lifeboats, Bob?
Yeah, supposedly they were the ones that were allowed to get on the lifeboats first, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, but there's a lot of accounts, of course, that John Jacob Astor did not get on a lifeboat. He might have wanted to, but they didn't let him on one. But he was seeing, some heroic paintings of his, last few minutes of helping other people get on the lifeboats. But neither of these guys survived among the 705 survivors on the Titanic.
Do you think Leonardo DiCaprio was really portraying John Jacob Astor?
He might have been John Jacob's little Astor, but
I certainly wasn't. Astor actually he sat down with his chauffeur in a deck chair right by the grand staircase, like I was telling you off air, Bob. And they just they sat down and they smoked cigars and drank brandy, and he figured he was going to take it like a man. I mean, he knew eventually he realized that they were going to die and that they weren't going to get off the ship, so he decided to go down at least like as he said, we're prepared to go down like gentlemen. That's a quote from him, from one of the survivors.
Yeah, and there were some other people, too. I was looking at the list. This thing was a little bit like Herod the Great, back in the old days of, the first century, Bob, where Herod the Great would invite all of his friends, his so-called friends, to a party. Then he'd bar the door and burn the place down and kill them all.
Yes, exactly. You know what? Great analogy, Steve. Great way to show that this wouldn't be the first time that this had been done in history.
Right. And we see a lot of situations developing pretty much along those lines here. And, of course, if our listeners have had the chance, and if you Google Morgan Robertson and look at this book, The Titan, you realize that there's far more than just a coincidence here. The entire thing was scripted. The book about this Titan, the wreck of the Titan, was the same size ship, 3,000 people, the exact same number of people on board the Titan that were on board the Titanic. The ships were virtually mirror copies of each other. And in the story, the Titan runs into an ice shelf. Now, this is an important point because this is what really intrigued me about all of this. Edward J. Smith was headed for an ice shelf. I think they hit the iceberg by mistake and by the grace of God, because if they hadn't hit that iceberg, I think almost everybody would have gone down. But one thing for certain, Bob, John Jacob Astor and Guggenheim, Strauss, so many of these other people that were on there, and there were a lot of very important mining people on there. That's why you have, Molly Brown. She was one of the silver mining people that were there. A lot of very big holdings. Also a very important ambassador from the United States who had been at Rome was there as well. I mean, if you look at the guest list, it's kind of like what we were saying, Popeye, the same situation. There's certain people they want to get rid of.
It's like a who's who at the time of, who was important.
Absolutely. They were lured into this trap. Now, why wasn't J.P. Morgan on board? He had his own private suite, in his own gold-plated bathtub, I suppose. But, he had a lucky Larry Silverstein moment, didn't he? I mean, at the last minute, he just was called away and couldn't make the ship.
Yeah, like a doctor's appointment or some excuse, and I'm being sarcastic about the doctor's appointment thing, of course. But yeah, you're right. He, at the last minute, he just didn't get on board, and all of the, just like a Harad moment, oh, guys, go ahead, I'll be in there in a moment. Close the doors, burn it down. I mean, that's pretty much what happened.
Yeah. I mean, and the whole situation is, it looks to me, it's pretty evident from looking at this old book that they scripted the entire thing. Now, there's a lot of good questions that people raise as to when they started to design the Titanic, when the Federal Reserve Act went into effect. But the reality is, the book that was called The Wreck of the Titan, Futility, The Wreck of the Titan by Morgan Robertson, and you can Google that, you can see the book. We're going to post pictures of the cover. This was the mirror story. So this thing was scripted. It was right down to the T. The ships were the same name. The Titan, the Titanic, essentially the same. And what happened with the Titan was that they ran into this ice shelf. And that's one of the big parts about this whole story that really nobody knows much about. And that is that there was literally a floating iceberg out there that they were headed for. Not an iceberg, but an ice cap. I mean, this was like running into a brick wall is what it was essentially doing. I mean, there wasn't a little way that you could kind of weed in and out around icebergs that were floating out in the ocean in these big, huge... I mean, this was literally an ice cap that he was headed into. And he knew it was there. He had to have known it was there. There were at least 6 or 7 warnings. Everybody, all the ships in the vicinity knew it was there. And this man was headed into this thing in the middle of the night, just like in the book, The Wreck of the Titan. And it's pretty evident to me that this thing, after all these years, has never really been looked at the way it should have been looked at. Just like, this was the 9/11 and got away from us, I guess, guys. Way back then.
When we get back after this quick break that we're going to take in just a moment, I want to talk about the wreck of the Titan and the similarities. I just want to list them for our listeners so they see that, maybe one similarity, maybe two, maybe three, but it just goes on and on and on. And then at some point throughout the show tonight, I want to talk about the Jesuit connection to this. Good old Vatican. You already mentioned that who was it that went to Rome?
It was, I think, the fellow's name was Butts, I think. I'll look that up.
He was a diplomat or whatnot for the U.S., right?
Right. He was actually a representative and, worked for the Roosevelt administration in the Department of the Navy. And he was there in Vatican for some reason. He was on his way back as well. This is one of those people they may have actually assassinated before the ship went down. But it's also hard to say because some of these people seem to have disappeared before the lifeboats were being manned, or they didn't quite know where they were. Molly Brown obviously was very vocal, but there were a lot of other people. We'll find out I'll see if I can find that list of some of those distinguished people who were invited to this disaster.
Yeah, because, I'm interested to know more about, just why these people were taken out. And what
Morgan owned the White Star Line, by the way, as a caveat, Bob, so you know. J.P.
Right.
Morgan owned the White Star Line and actually commissioned the building of the Titanic and her two sister ships.
Yeah, and we'll talk about J.P. Morgan's connection in this as well. All right, guys, fascinating show. I'm glad we decided to do this, and it just so happened that these stupid stories came out in the news. Of all things, now several years after that Titanic propaganda piece came out, on today, same day we were planning to do a show on this very topic, the Hollywood film Titanic announced that they would be releasing a 3D version of the film in theaters around the world. And we will be releasing more on the other side of this, something that I even never thought of, and I thought about it all, but sure enough, there's more. We'll be back on the Bob Tuskin Show. Don't go anywhere. Are we going to have to hear that Celine Dion song again? What was that song?
We will go on, Bob.
You just made
My heart will go on.
Back, guys, I have to go throw up right now.
Oh, please. All right, we're talking about the Titanic, and it's the Bob Tuskin Show, and we're talking about this book that was published 11 years before the actual 14 years, okay, and it's called The Wreck of the Titan. Okay, The Wreck of the Titan. And Steve, fill in the gaps here. What's the deal with this?
Okay, well, this fellow Morgan Robertson was kind of a freelance writer. He, wasn't he was a pulp fiction kind of a guy back in the late 1800s. He wrote a lot of books actually. A lot of them had to do with the sea. But this book that he wrote called Futility, The Wreck of the Titan, was published in 1898. Now, you can find this. It's real easy. There's all kinds of things up on the internet. Just Google Morgan Robertson, and you'll see Futility, The Wreck of the Titan. And this is a story of a ship, the world's largest ship that had ever been built, that was a first-class type ship that was intended to carry all these wealthy people back and forth between Great Britain and New York, just like the Titanic. The ship was almost virtually the same size. The Titan was almost identical to the Titanic. I'll just read you some comparisons. They were both British ships, HMS. They were the length of the Titan was 800 feet. The Titanic was 882 feet. They were both made of steel. The weight of the Titan displacement was 45,000. The Titanic was actually a little bit bigger at 66,000. They both had roughly the same amount of horsepower, 40,000 for the Titan, 46,000 for the Titanic. There were 3 propellers and 3 shafts, 2 masts on both ships, watertight compartments. The Titan actually had 19. The Titanic had 16. A few less, huh? And the number of lifeboats which was not enough, by the way, on the Titan. There was 24 on the Titan. There was 20 on the Titanic, even less. Isn't that odd? But the passenger capacity was identical. 3,000 on the Titan, 3,000 on the Titanic. The passengers on board on the Titan were 3,000. They didn't quite book all the tickets because I guess some of the people decided maybe they'd wait and see if the ship would float. 2,228 on the Titanic. They both did 25 knots and were doing virtually full speed when they ran into the ice. They both had the time of impact near midnight. Titanic was at 11:40 p.m. They both ran into the ice on the starboard side, and both these accidents happened at night in April, 400 miles, almost identically from Newfoundland. Mm-hmm. Now here's the key thing, though, Bob. There were only 13 survivors out of the total capacity of passengers on the Titan. There were 705 on the Titanic. So this is where I'm saying that I actually believe that Smith was intending to hit this ice pack. He was literally running into a minefield of ice in which it would end in literally a brick wall, a floating ice cap. This thing was like a tongue of ice that extended all the way down almost 70 miles and 5 miles wide. There are pictures of it on the internet. People have actually photographed this. There were ships just on the other side of this ice that couldn't get to the Titanic to help them because they couldn't sail through the ice cap. I mean, that's where he was headed. He had to know it was there. And his intent, I believe, was to take just about everybody down. I think that by the grace of God, if you like, they hit the iceberg, which really surprised the captain. If you've seen the movie, even in that, James Cameron's, public relations campaign for the Empathy Titanic story, Captain Smith emerges out of his wherever he was, his meditation room, something like that. And he says, "What, already? We've already hit something?" I think he was surprised that they actually hit the iceberg before they hit the ice pack, because he was expecting to hit it probably after midnight. And so as a result, 705 people did survive because they did get into the few lifeboats that they had, and some people were able to get out alive.
Let's draw some similarities here to other events. Best by the grace of God, we saw that the USS Liberty wasn't completely destroyed.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, you know that story because we've had, our friends on, I'm trying to think of the gentleman that we've had on.
Phil Turney.
Phil Turney, that's right.
He survived.
Yes, he was on the Liberty, and he experienced this horrific experience of being bombed by these unmarked Israeli jets in the Six-Day War. I mean, this was another one of those situations where the ship should have survived, but it did. That's another very good one, Bob. What are the others? You got some other comparisons there?
Well, we talked about the lone gunman and some similarities there. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, 11 months before 9/11, they made Chris Carter, the guy that was responsible for the X-Files, and Dean Hageland was actually interviewed by an older Oracle host a while ago, and he admitted on air that the CIA had actually given Chris Carter that script for that episode, but it was the U.S. government, a rogue element, hijacked 2 airplanes and remotely flew them into the World Trade Center to start a war in the Middle East, and they were going to blame it on Muslims. And this is 11 months before 9/11.
Wow. Yeah, it's amazing too, And if you didn't catch the imagery of the title of that show, The Lone Gunman, it's not like Paladin or Matt Dillon. The Lone Gunman is always who? Lee Harvey Oswald, John Hinckley, Nanette Quickly Frome, Sirhan, Jack Ruby. You know what I mean? John Wilkes Booth. The Lone Gunman is always the story, isn't it? It's the cover story. It was another lone gunman who shot Yitzhak Rabin. It was another lone gunman who shot John Lennon, Mark David Chapman. It's always a lone crazy gunman, and the theme of that show was always about something beyond the lone gunman. And here you see a story where 9/11, the whole scenario is virtually uncanny and impeccably articulate in the exact situation that takes place with these planes fly. With only one plane, wasn't it? It was destined to hit apparently the World Trade Center, but it flew away and got off at the last minute. And in this situation, of course, 9/11, that's not what happened at all, is it?
Oh, no. You're right. It was in that scenario. It was one plane, and they were able to. I think they were able to jam the control or whatever. But I mean, even in the show, they were like, oh, they've got sophisticated control box hooked up to the avionics, so there's no way for us to just try to. We'd have to block the signal. We can't. We have to turn the box off or whatever. I mean, this is stuff that we've since 9/11. Many of us have said, hey, look, they had the capability to do this, and people are like, oh. You tinfoil hat wearers. You people are crazy to think they would do that. Why are we crazy to think they would do that? Look, our president lied us at the time. Bush lied us into a war that has killed over 1.5 million innocent Iraqi people. They are wiped. And even if some of them were attacking our guys, okay, even if you include those in there too, okay, whatever. The point is, there's 1.5 million human beings that are gone from this planet. Because that's all based on a lie. So if you look at that, killing 3,000 people, you really think they're going to care about killing 3,000 people? They just offed 1.5 million people. Do you really think an extra 3,000 or 4,000 is really going to even register on their radar?
Getting back to that Titanic story, too, it's the same thing. They don't really care how many innocents they take down, as long as they accomplish their agenda.
They call it collateral damage. They don't care.
Yeah. And they're actually kind of pleased and tickled with themselves. I wonder, here's a question that I'll pose to you guys, see what you think, Popeye and Bob. There's been always this sort of this psychopathic mindset that some people have. It's almost like the Jack the Ripper note, like the Riddler out of Batman. In other words, they have to leave clues somewhere about who it is and what they're up to. So, here they follow to the script, essentially, the story of the Titan that slams into this ice shelf. Then they have the lone gunman, which gives you another clue. We have so many stories out there, and it seems like they just continue to leave these little clues as if they can say, we're so intelligent that we'll even tell you what we're going to do, and you still can't catch us or stop us. Is that does that resonate
right
with you guys?
Right in front of your face, in plain sight. That's the best place to do it, and the occult. They get off on this sort of thing. We've talked about this with Mark Passio, that is one of their favorite things to do, is just to make it so blatant, so in front of your face, but there's nothing you can do about it. So that sort of control that they get off on is a big part of this, Steve. When we get back, we'll talk a little bit more about the Titan, and we'll finish off the talk about the similarities between the Titan and the Titanic. We're talking about the Titanic tonight, an event connected to a lot of what's taken place so far in the 20th and 21st century. And, of course, there's all sorts of ties to this with J.P. Morgan's name written all over it. Very similar to Larry Silverstein in many respects. J.P. Morgan had an insurance policy on the ship and much more. The event at Jekyll Island was about to take place. We'll get into that in just a moment, folks, and also talk about the Jesuit connection to this also at some point. All right, don't go anywhere. This is the Bob Tuskin Radio Show. All right, as promised, we'll continue this great show on the Titanic, man. That's when I thought I knew it all. Let's talk about J.P. Morgan's connection to this, and then also let's finish the connection here with the book, The Titan. We went over a lot of the similarities last segment, and then next hour we'll really dive deep into the bigger picture, what this meant, and the Jesuit connection, which Steve is particularly interested in. Steve or Popeye, maybe Popeye, you want to pick up with J.P. Morgan?
Well, I mean, like I was saying before we went to break, he owned the White Star Line. Okay, he built the Titanic and her two sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic. And the Britannic, ironically, was hit by a mine 4 years later and sunk in very much the same fashion that the Titanic did.
Oh, that's just a coincidence.
Yeah, but but don't pay attention to anything like that. Anyway, he he invited these guys on board. He made sure that he personally made sure that these people were invited on board the maiden voyage. And a lot of like the movie Titanic misled a lot of people with a lot of stuff. I mean, not only did it try to keep you distracted with the BS love story and all that crap, but like when they leave Belfast and you see them pulling out, you how come you don't see them pull into like they did 1 or 2 port calls before they went out and sailed off into history.
Right.
And interestingly enough, they changed out crews. And one of like I said, they have on ships they have what's called big eyes, which are binoculars. You can see usually 9-10 miles with them. Mm-hmm. And they had them all locked up in these nice wooden cabinets. And there was only one key and one crew member with the key to the lock. And he happened to get switched out at the first port call.
So they had no binoculars. Yes, that's been an issue for a long time as to why the Point Guards Fleet was one of them up there, a man by the name of Fleet, who had actually seen the iceberg. Now you got to remember, this was the water was just like glass that night. I mean, it was so quiet, and it was a moonless night. And normally when you have a little bit of a wake, you can see the waves brushing up against some of the ice, but they have a very difficult time seeing anything out there in the dark, this dark, when the water is so calm. And they had no binoculars. And some people say, well, you can actually see icebergs better with the naked eye. Well, that may be the case, but the point is when Fleet spotted the iceberg, kind of like you saw in the movie, it took almost 30 to 40 seconds for the bridge to answer before they began to turn. And the Titanic had a very little rudder. I mean, it would virtually take about maybe 3 miles to turn around under the momentum that it had. It wasn't like a speedboat. Okay.
Yeah, interestingly enough, it was just a bit too small to make the turn that it needed to avoid that iceberg. Isn't that coincidental?
Yeah, the whole thing was very poorly designed. And what you were saying, Popeye, was very true too, because what you have is a situation. The White Star Line was owned by J.P. Morgan, and Morgan also had a very strong interest in the International Merchant Marine Company, which also owned the Californian and Lusitania. Okay, so he had a big part of all this international shipping. Now, the Californian was a ship that had come across the bow, or they'd seen the Titanic, and they had and all these warnings about the ice coming in from the Temple Mount, the Titanic, a number of different other ships, the Californian, a number of other different ships warning them about what was out there. What was really interesting is that the Californian ignored all of the disaster signals, which were the flares. They didn't get on the wireless to contact to make sure what was going on, and then they beat the hell out of there the next morning, so they weren't anywhere close to where the disaster took place. This ship was also owned by J.P. Morgan. And to talk a little bit about the construction for just a minute, the Titanic, oddly enough, had only about a 1-inch thick hull. Can you imagine this? I mean, a ship displacing all this water with only a 1-inch thick hull. You could basically sink the Titanic with a sledgehammer. And it was far from unsinkable. As a matter of fact, it was a death trap. And as you pointed out, Popeye, its sister ship, the Britannic, went down the Mediterranean. Its other ship, the Olympic, which was almost very much the same size, had a brush-in with a naval vessel from the British called the Hawk. And by the way, Captain Smith was piloting the ship. Well, what happened was the Hawk got swept in next to it while they were trying to pull the Titanic out, and the swell from the Titanic pulled the small ship up. It brushed up against the side of the Olympic, and the same thing happened with the Olympic that happened with the Titanic. Those rivets popped just like buttons off a shirt, and the whole side opened up. Water flowed into the watertight compartments, and the ship listed incredibly. Now, Smith was able to get the Olympic back, I guess it was to Southampton or Belfast, wherever they were rebuilding it. They had to replace the drive shaft because they bent the drive shaft on the Olympic and it delayed the Titanic's construction and finishing and completion. But what happened at that time was evident to me that he knew damn well all you had to do was brush something with one of these ships and the hull would split open. So now here's another part of this whole story. This man has had 25 years of experience in the North Atlantic. He knows about these ice flows. This is not 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Everybody is on the wireless. You can hear transmissions on the telegraph from New York all the way to Europe, back and forth. It's like the internet today, but the telegraph. Everybody knew what the weather conditions were out there. Smith had to have known that ice field was there before they left port. I mean, something is very wrong with this whole story. This man was a psychopathic madman determined to sink the ship. Why? Because he was under orders and obligation. And when you get into the very high realms of some of these occultic Luciferian organizations, you either do what they tell you or you're dead yourself. So the man had no choice. After 25 years, this is going to be his last maiden voyage, or his last final hurrah, I guess it is, maiden voyage for the Titanic, last voyage for him. Why would he want to risk his reputation, his whole life, on coming in and destroying a beautiful ship liner like this with a stupid mistake? There has to be something more to all of this. He knew that ice
field was there.
Absolutely, he died.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Some say he shot himself. Of course, in the movie, he's, looking through the windows, I think, and trying to, and then the water breaks through the bridge windows. But, I think actually some people have said that he actually shot himself.
Who's Smith?
Yeah, Smith is.
Yeah, and a lot of people also, there's a myth that he was drunk at the time. A lot of people say that, he was a drunk and that's why he didn't realize what happened. It's always pilot, same thing with Paul Wellstone's with his plane crash. The two pilots, they blamed pilot negligence and pilot error for the crash.
Really?
So same thing. Here you go. Oh, it's all Captain Smith's fault. Blame the pilot. Every time they don't have an answer for why something crashed or they don't want to tell you the answer, it's always pilot error. I'm doing air quotes.
All right, Steve, we have about less than a minute here. Final thoughts for this hour.
Okay, we just can take it from wherever people want to go with this. We'll continue if necessary, but the whole thing is it was scripted. Read the book, Futility, Wreck of the Titan. Just Google Morgan Robertson, and you'll come up with the story. You can see the similarities between the story. This was the book, the script of the Titanic that was written 14 years before the disaster. This is not psychic energy. Ooh. This is somebody taking this book and creating a death trap based on the model that was already written in a novel.
Very, very shocking stuff. We'll continue to talk about this next hour. A show of Titanic proportions. That's right. This is the Bob Tuskin Show. We'll be back in just a moment, folks. Don't go anywhere. What is that noise? I don't know.
It's the CIA listening to the show, Bob.
All right, here we go, guys. Stand by. We'll be right back. April 15th, which happens to be my birthday, and tax day, as well as the day that the Titanic sunk, and the day that Abraham Lincoln died. What do all these things have in common? We'll talk about that this hour on the Bob Tuskin Show. If you're just joining us, we're doing a special on the Titanic of Titanic proportions. Joining us has been our good friend Popeye of FederalJack.com, and Steve Stars, our correspondent on this and so many other great issues. We'll talk about the Jesuit connection this hour and continue a look at what this meant for the 20th and 21st century. Steve, you want to give a quick overview of some of the things that we covered? And then it's a short segment, but I promise we'll get into this a bit more in depth and definitely take a look at the Jesuit connection.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions about it. Of course, we know about the Jesuit oath, where, if somebody belongs to this organization, Bob, and they're very determined. I mean, it's one of those solemn things that you get involved with and move up in certain levels. And if Edward Smith, who was, by the way, a Methodist most of all of his life, but there's a very good article here that I was looking at that was actually associating him with some of these very important people who were, either Jesuit coadjutors or temporal Jesuits, or people who had been involved with some of those kinds of, those very heavy disciplines where these guys take vows into death. So when you have a person like Captain Edward Smith who's under a vow and he's being told what to do, it's either do or die. Popeye, I think he just posted that quote there, one of the significant parts from the oath. And if Popeye, are you there, buddy? You want to read that?
This is the most significant part. It says, I should regard myself as a dead body, without will or intelligence, as a little crucifix which is turned about restingly at the will of him who holds it as a staff in the hands of an old man, who uses it as he requires it and as it suits him best. So they're saying, I am a puppet of the Jesuit order. Use me, abuse me, I will do whatever you want me to do.
Yeah, and it's also the same kind of thing because it mirrors itself almost identically in Freemasonry. I mean, you find the very same kind of intense loyalties that are required by these people as they excel and move up over a period of time. And so, it's a serious question as to, was Edward J. Smith, was he so, insane that he would create this disaster without any motive at all? Was he secretly mentally ill or a psychopath? I don't think so. I mean, if you look at who benefits again, if you look at why this thing happened and what was the outgrowth of it all, I mean, they eliminated all competition of very wealthy people who would have opposed this private central banking system called the Federal Reserve. 1 year later, we had the Federal Reserve going into effect, or at least being the first 12 banks were beginning to sign on. It took a little bit longer before it actually went into full effect. But then World War I breaks out the next year. And then you've got this 100-year plan that we keep hearing about, with the 3 world wars. It looks like we're approaching the 3rd one right now. But this whole plan to control the world by the order out of chaos model.
Sure. As long as we can keep the people in a state of chaos and continue to create havoc, like things such as the Titanic being sunk and so much more, we will be in control. We'll get to that with Steve Stars and Popeye at FederalJack.com in just a moment on the Bob Tuskin Show.
Take a trip today with J.P. Morgan and Friends Travel Associates. We have several vacation destinations for you, including the lovely Titanic. Contact Bob Tuskin for more details.
Welcome back, folks. That's right. We'll tell you more details about exactly what did take place with the Titanic. And joining us is our good friend Popeye and Steve Stars. Steve, where do we leave off?
Well, we were talking a lot about, the incidents that set all this up, how the ship was constructed. This was constructed, by the way, by a part of Belfast that was Protestant. They weren't hiring Catholics, so the company already had some difficulties, in Ireland as to the workers that were building this thing. And of course, we mentioned before that the Olympic and the Britannic and the Titanic were all essentially death traps. The Britannic sunk in the Mediterranean after being torpedoed, another mysterious incident. Of course, the Titanic hit the iceberg out there and went down. The Olympic actually was, refitted. They went back and they put about 2 or 3 feet of concrete inside the hull and refitted the hull. And the Olympic actually ended up serving during World War I and World War II, and was retired in about 1936, something like that. But initially, all 3 of those ships were death traps, and they weren't unsinkable. They were like, eggshell thin hulls that were displacing huge amounts of water, just waiting to be a disaster that was ready to happen. And, of course, Edward J. Smith would have known this. He had already experienced this very hull snapping, the rivets breaking open on the hull when he brushed up against the Hawk pulling out of harbor one time and nearly sunk the Olympic. So all he needed to do was just find any iceberg, and he was headed right into a brick wall, literally a brick wall of ice. He was headed into an ice cap. He just happened to hit an iceberg on the way in, is what happened. And it had to hit the ice cap or the entire ice shelf. This thing was like a tongue of ice. It was like about 70 miles long, 5 miles wide. You can see pictures of it on the internet. Just Google Titanic ice flow. There are actual photographs of this thing. You can see 200-foot mounds of ice floating out, in a huge, long stretch of flat ice. It was an ice cap. It was floating out in the North Atlantic. It was about 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. And this is the exact same place in the book The Titan, where the ship, the Titan ran into. Futility Wreck of the Titan by Morgan Robertson.
Interesting.
So, yeah, I mean, it's odd, but we talked so much about the coincidences. We talked about Phil Turney and the USS Liberty. We talked about the lone gunman, how that foreshadowed and foretold us about 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever see The Long Kiss Goodbye?
No.
That has an interesting part about it,
Oh,
too.
in the very end.
Yes.
Yes, you're very right, Steve.
Another prophetic thing. You remember that, Popeye? Was that one?
Yeah.
Tell us about it.
The Long Kiss Goodnight has Gina Davis in it. It came out in 1999, and basically she's a mind-controlled assassin from the Cold War era that I don't remember if they tried to kill her, if they just shut her off or whatever, but somehow I think they had tried to kill her, and the incident ended up she didn't die, she survived, but it had kind of, the trauma to her head had given her amnesia, and she had forgotten who she was. Years later, she comes to realize who she is, and she finds out that one of the guys that she was sent to kill, who was this foreign, and he was like a mercenary or whatever, he's now working with the head of the CIA, and basically they need funding. And because they need funding and they can't get it because Congress is like, no, you guys are out of control, the CIA needs to chill itself, they're going to do what they called in the movie a fundraiser. And basically, they were going to take a Muslim guy who they had killed already, and interestingly enough, they had his body in a cooler.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. They took the Muslim guy out of the cooler when they needed him. Okay. And this guy was, I guess he was like a known terrorist or whatever at the time, and they had whacked him and then kept him on ice, kind of like Bin Laden. Yeah. Took him out, put him in a tractor trailer, and they were gonna remotely drive the tractor trailer into a city and then detonate it with like a small nuke on it. And basically, they were gonna kill like 7 to like 8,000 people was their goal. And he said that the head of the CIA is talking to her. In the end, she's all tied up, and she says, you're going to do this. This is a fundraiser. And he said, yeah, unfortunately, I don't know how to fake killing 7,000 people, so I'm just going to have to do it for real.
Yeah, right.
And this was less than 2 years before 9/11. And he even says we're going to blame it on the Muslims.
Right.
I hear that a lot like 9/11, there was thermite involved to take out the Titanic.
Well, there was definitely explosives of that sort being used in the Long Kiss Goodbye. And, I forgot, Papa, I had forgotten all about that. They had the dead Muslim guy in the cooler. That's another thing that just hit me, you know what I mean?
Yeah, he kind of looks like a fat Saddam Hussein, the guy they used. Because I just saw the movie about 3 weeks ago. That's why I remember that specifically, because that caught my eye. When I saw that, I was like, and I said to myself, Bin Laden on ice. And then, boom, 2 weeks ago, we got him.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it? It's just astounding how these people leave these hints, because it's almost like this psychopathic ideology that if they tell us what they're going to do and we don't catch on, we deserve it. You know what I mean? Because we're too stupid. I mean, this is their attitude toward us. That if we're not smart enough to catch them, then we're not smart enough to rule the world, and that justifies this kind of psychopathic, sick mindset that these people have. It's like Jack the Ripper leaving all these notes around everywhere, and they're really, really dangerous.
And interestingly enough about Jack the Ripper, if you do your research on him, you come to find out he was the
We talked about this with Christopher Everard.
The medic, or not the medic, he was like the doctor to the royal family at the time, and he had syphilis or whatever, and it made him crazy. Well, that's what they say, it made him crazy or whatever. But he was going out and doing this. A lot of people, if you look into it, and I'm sure Christopher said this, a lot of people think that he was going out and getting body parts for the royals to use in satanic rituals, and that's why it was covered up the way it was covered up. Because he was almost like, I mean, he was sick, but he was almost doing it at the behest of the royals, because they do use human body parts, especially certain organs, for rituals and stuff. They eat them, they use them, they drink blood out of, like the heart, and then they'll consume the heart and stuff. And this is not, just because none of us do it and believe in it, and I'm sure 99.9% of the audience, except for the scumbags that work for the New World Order that are listening, don't do it. But you have to understand, your enemy does this. Doesn't matter if you don't believe in this, your enemy does this kind of crap. Yeah. I mean, why did it take Princess Diana so long to get taken to the hospital? Why did the ambulance drive so slow? And a lot of people have said that the surgeon that was in there had actually cut her open and made her wounds worse and literally cut organs out of her and stuff. And then this guy, he was the surgeon that did it. He's a very well-known, connected person. It's not coincidental that these people that are all connected to each other just happen to be on the scene.
They're cannibals. They're pedophiles and cannibals. And, we continue to cover this. We'll get back into that in just a moment on the Bob Tuskin Show. Interesting stuff. I didn't know where this would quite take us, but there's lots of different aspects of it, so don't go anywhere. More to come.
Serving for dinner. For the captain's ball, we have hearts and lungs. And for the final meal of the ship, we'll have your tongue.
Hey, this
Vatican connection to the Titanic conspiracy on the Bob Tuskin Show. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Let's jump right back into it. Joining us live on the program tonight is our correspondent on the Titanic. It's none other than Steve Stars, talking about the Jesuit connection. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, we did mention that there was a very important person. I think we did talk about Francis Brown, this Jesuit priest, who was the last, he was a Jesuit priest who boarded the Titanic. He took the pictures, the photographs of the ship. As a matter of fact, in the movie Titanic, you'll see this one photograph of Edward Smith looking out from the bridge, way up the side of the ship, looking down. You can actually see that on the internet. He was the one that took that photograph. My guess is that he gave any last rites or any final commands and orders to go ahead and finish this project to Smith before he got off. Now, he was supposed to have gone all the way as well, but he decided to jump off at the last stop. I guess it was in Belfast before they took to the open sea. So this man was a Jesuit priest who was on board, and I suppose that his photographic equipment was loaded down pretty heavy when he left, because he probably cleaned out the purse. I mean, after all, those people are going to need their gold, their silver, their wallets, their jewels, their insurance policies at the bottom of the ocean. So, I mean, this is the kind of thing that was happening all along through the whole deal. The whole thing was a setup. It was a death trap. It was people were being lured into this, and they had one crazy man who, somehow got hooked into the ideology of eternal life through, the restoration of the Jesuit Union sometime in the near distant future. I don't know where they're coming from. But these people are sick, and they begin to believe in this system, and they become the robots or the command agents, as we talked about before, and as Popeye had read that portion of the oath. The same thing is true with Freemasons, and I've been looking at some of Edward Smith's background. It's very difficult to actually identify him as being in touch or in collusion with these Jesuit agents, because he was a Methodist. But you have to realize that when you get into the higher realms of Freemasonry, and we get into Skull and Bones, it's all the same people. It really is. I mean, whether they're just as interchangeable as Sylvania and GE light bulbs. I mean, you could have Tom Ridge set up Homeland Security as a Jesuit, and Michael Chertoff a Jew. Dual citizen Jew takes over. It's the same people. Skull and Bones is John Kerry. Was Jesuit trained along school with George W. Bush. It's the same people all the time.
Leon Panetta.
Yes, there's a guy that's Jesuit schooled for sure. He came right through Georgetown, along with David Petraeus. Both of them in Edmund Walsh, the School of Foreign Affairs. It was started by a Jesuit priest at Georgetown. Another one was Tenet. Tenet was there, but Bill Clinton was there.
I was going to say Bill Clinton, Jesuit trained.
Yep, there's a lot of them. Steve, the question I have, it comes down to this. What does this mean for us now? What did the Titanic do? And why was it so important in, I guess, the big picture?
Well, I think the real thing, Bob, was that, at this point, remember, we had the Rothschild merger of the banks with the Vatican in 1822. Already they controlled most of the foreign banks. And at this point, they needed to expand into control of the New World because they had things like big plans ahead, like World War I, World War II. I mean, this is at the moment where we were still fighting to hold on to some semblance of our own banking system. And of course, J.P. Morgan had panicked everybody in the stock market crash of 1907. And when that happened, everybody was saying, well, maybe we should have some sort of a central bank. And all the time, these bankers were feigning the wrong direction, saying, no, we don't want a central bank. No, we don't want a central bank. While in 1910, they're meeting in Jekyll Island, deciding that's exactly what they're going to set up. So the reason why the Titanic is so important is because it's that moment to where the international banking cartel finally takes over the United States, Canada, a good portion of the New World banking that was going on in the United States, and brings us under the control of that whole system as well. And lo and behold, you know what I mean? That's the connection. I know that you see that, but a lot of people say, well, yeah, I can see part of it. But that's actually when we lost the control of our economy to the international bank.
Sure. Let's take a couple of quick phone calls and jump right back into it. What do you say?
Okay. Sounds good.
People have been waiting for some time. I want to give a chance to some callers. Let's see here. We have a gentleman from Canada on the line, I believe. Go ahead. What's your comment?
Hello, is that me?
Yes, that's you. Go ahead.
Oh, Chief. Okay, I wanted to know what do you think is really what's happening when he said that's when we lost it. That's when we lost the economics. That's when we lost the whole train of thought to what is happening in our life as compared to money. Because I think it goes a lot further than that.
I agree.
I think he's right, yeah. Go ahead, Steve.
I agree. Yeah, I was just saying that's at the point of really the crossing of the Rubicon in terms of what had happened to our ability, coming out of the Civil War where Lincoln began issuing greenbacks. If you look at the assassinations of both Garfield, McKinley, and even Harding later on, there was so much at stake concerning the banking cartels, finances, trusts, all these different organizations they were grappling for financial control of the United States. And at this point, they were, the New World Order people, this cartel of Jesuit, Rothschild, banking people who had, formulated their grip and handle on the United States. I believe at that point took over complete control because now you have the Federal Reserve formed at the same time the IRS is being formed. And actually, the Council on Foreign Relations was formulating at that time. It didn't officially start until, I believe it was 1921, but the Council on Foreign Relations was formulating at that same time as well. So I wonder if that answers this question. But what I'm saying, this is at the point where we cross the Rubicon. Right. Is what I'm getting at. Does that answer his question?
I hope it does. Let's get one more quick caller on the line here before we come to another break. And then we'll dive deeper into this and maybe take a few more calls at 866-841-1065. That's the number to join us on the show tonight. Let's see here. Rich in Florida, what's on your mind, buddy?
Hey, I've always been a researcher of the Titanic and stuff, and I was wondering what your guests might have thought about the fact that when you think about how these Illuminati banking, these demons, money power, these big, the way they are, what do you think is the possibility that, they built the Olympic at the same time as the Titanic, and that they probably skimped and overinflated the costs with the intention that they would sink the Titanic? It would all be insured, and that possibly when all these richest people on the planet, were boarding and giving their valuables, diamonds, gold, money, to the purser, that at some point, either in Cherbourg or that it never really was put on the ship, that they took all all their valuables and somehow got it off the ship before it headed out across the Atlantic.
All right.
Because they knew it was never going to make it across.
Sure. Steve, your thoughts?
Well, we covered a little bit of that. I think maybe this Jesuit priest, Francis Brown, left with a lot of the booty in his photographic cases. That wouldn't surprise me. Or they could have just loaded it off on certain other places and said this was a mail drop or something like that. Very good chance that they did empty the purser's safe before the ship actually set sail. Nobody would have ever known.
Well, they haven't found anything. How come every dive, if they've gone down there, and they've gone and pulled safes out now, they've been going in and out of the Titanic for like 15 years, how come they haven't found one thing full of gold or jewelry or anything? How come all the physical stuff, paper money, whatever crap, that was in the safe, okay, but how come they didn't find any hardcore jewelry or anything of any wealth or value on board? The China and all that crap, whatever, but you know what I mean. Where was it all? How come all these multiple trips through all these submersibles into the ship, where's all the booty?
Well, they probably shipped it to China, along with a lot of the debris that was left at the Trade Center. All right, folks, when we pick it up in just a second, we'll continue the talk about Titanic, and also we'll talk a little bit about a few other things that we had in mind to share with you. So we'll allow for ourselves to go down any rabbit hole that we see fit in the upcoming segments. So don't go anywhere. This is the Bob Tuskin Show. (866-841-1065) number to join us on the program. That's 866-841-1065. And if I could say the number any faster, I would. All right, folks, we do have some callers, and we're talking with Steve Stars and Popeye at FederalJack.com. If you're just tuning in, we've been discussing the Titanic, what it means, something that I took for granted was, just what we heard it was, a ship that hit this, giant ice boulder or iceberg. What is it called? An ice boulder or iceberg? What do they call it?
It was an iceberg, but I think they were actually anticipating hitting an ice field, an ice cap, huge brick wall. They never made it that far.
We talked about that a little bit beforehand. Let's take another call, Steve, if we can, and then we'll jump right back into some more about the Jesuit connections, because I don't think we quite finished that.
Yeah, you had a really good caller calling in just a few minutes ago, I think.
Okay, let's see here. Do we have MJ from Illinois?
Hello.
Welcome to the show. What's your question?
Are you guys sitting down?
We are not, so go ahead.
Okay. There was I believe it was either Finnish or Swedish expedition in 2005 that went down in these mini subs. 1 mile from the two sections of the Titanic, the bow and the stern, they found 2 other pieces to the Titanic. They were 30 feet long by 92 feet wide. 2 lower hull sections. They blew the bottom of this ship out. That's why it's split in 2.
Thermite.
Why this isn't getting any more coverage, I don't know.
See, I was onto something when I said there might be thermite involved with this, guys. That on the surface,
how a ship breaks in half. You blow the keel out of it.
Yeah, you have to. He's correct. As a retired sailor myself, he's correct. The keel is.
I'm a retired sailor also.
He's correct. You have to. The ship's backbone is the keel, and the only way to break a ship in half is to literally break the ship's back. And you need some powerful force to do that. And they're saying, I know their theory is that the ship uprighted itself and then snapped, which that very well may have happened, but you would have needed to have this massive rush of water. And they did say that they only found a portion of the hull that was, some of the hulls that were in the ship, and that most of it, a lot of it is buried below the silt line on the bottom, because when it impacted, it buried like 30 or 40 feet into the mud. So you actually really can't see the very bottom, and it's been down there so long, you try to pull it up, it's gone.
That's interesting. Really is. So it was like, you can see this is one of those things that was wired, several times. If it didn't lose it right away in the ice field, they would blow out the hull in one way or the other. They were taking that ship down. This is definitely a premeditated murder, it looks like. Was that your impression, caller? Is that what you saw there?
No, definitely they put the ship on the bottom.
Yeah.
Okay? The 92-foot width is the width of the hull. They blew it out from the port side to the starboard. 60 foot of the bottom of the boat is gone.
That's a big section of boat.
They probably hit the iceberg by accident.
I think you're probably right.
They probably blew the bottom of. They probably blew that 60-foot section of the hull out, and then because of that massive breach, they probably weren't able to steer, and maybe that's why they hit the iceberg. I mean, you lose your
water rushed in. Yeah,
the ship, even if it lost its engines, especially it would lose its engines right there because all that water rushes in. Back then, they were using boilers. The water hits, all that seawater hits those coal-fired boilers. Boom! That makes an even bigger explosion. That even causes a bigger problem. And now the ship doesn't have any power. Now it's dead in the water, except it's got to run out its full-on frontal course. So, I mean, who knows? And
why didn't we talk about this sooner in the show tonight, guys? I'm so glad you called, MJ.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's actually I didn't know until you called that they had found that that big of a piece of the hull had been blown out. And you're correct.
Right. This is not more widely known. This is amazing.
What other evidence do we have?
Well, they're suppressing it.
Is there MJ? Is there a way that us and the listeners, is there a link or something that we could go to or a website?
How I read about this was a year ago on Rents. Henry Macau.
Okay.
Somebody submitted it to Henry. His name was Watchdog, and the name of the article was Titanic and Hindenburg, 2 psyops, 1 agenda.
Okay,
now his reasoning behind it was they eliminated the Titanic and the Hindenburg so they could promote oil.
Interesting. Well, I still think, though, that we need to analyze what took place exactly before we look at the motive necessarily.
Right.
And it's fascinating to me to see that there's evidence of an explosion that took place. So what other evidence do we have that you know of?
I just read a long time ago about the Rockefellers wanting to get rid of the Astors.
Yeah. Well, that's something we covered.
They were in opposition to what the Rockefellers wanted.
But I'm interested to establish more of a case for the explosion.
Well, think about it. All they got to do is take a sea mine, and these guys know. For anybody to say, "Oh, they didn't have specialists or anything back then," it doesn't take a genius to take a sea mine and rig it up as a directional explosive. Put it back by the steam boilers, have it go off at a certain time. Or the boilers would be a perfect place because you blow a hole into the hull of the ship, water comes rushing in, hits those boiler fires, boom, blows the boilers out. Those would be massive explosions. Any boiler guy will tell you, a boiler explosion, back in the day, the old trains that they had, the old school trains that they used to use coal and stuff, those were boilers. You know why they had most of the train disasters? These things would blow up. I mean, they were like bombs. Boilers are really, really dangerous, especially the old school ones. So these things get hit by seawater, boom, blows a huge hole into the hull of the ship, and then now it starts to go down fast, drags the rear end down, drags the stern, bow comes up out of the water. Now, because of that explosion, you've already broken the back of the ship. It can't. The back is broken, but the skin is still there. You got to understand, the bone is broken underneath. All you have is that outward skin, and that structure is not built as a load-bearing structure, and that stuff would definitely give way and then cause the ship to break in half. So, I mean, MJ, your information is dead on accurate as to actually even how they say the ship snapped in two. That's a perfect explanation as to why it would do that.
The only way a ship will break in two is if you destroy the keel.
Exactly. You have to snap its back. It's the only way it's going to do that.
Right. And how fast was the ship going at the time they blew out the keel? All that water is continually pushed into the boat.
Yeah. Exactly. And then you take out, once you take out the boilers, there goes your whole powertrain is gone. It doesn't matter if you still have a rudder. How are you going to turn if you don't got no momentum?
Right.
You see, and just when I thought I was learning what really happened to the Titanic, this comes up. You see what I mean by never, stop.
And interestingly enough,
learn
the pursers
every day.
I mean, it never stopped.
The pursers that were firing off the flares, they were also, interestingly enough, the flares that they were, some of the flares that some of the crew members were firing off weren't the red, help us flares. Some of them were the white flares. And white flares means everything's okay, we're having a party.
Yeah, right.
Doing this show, I learned probably a bajillion things a day. It's amazing. And I know our listeners get the bang for their buck as well. Steve, you wanted to pipe in on what they just said?
Well, I was just going to say, it's interesting that all the excursions that James Cameron, and here's another work of art, too. We haven't even had a chance to talk about him and his Freemason connections and some of the really odd things that he's involved in. But it's odd that, his expedition didn't find anything like this. And we're hearing this from the, I guess it was the Swiss expedition. Is that right, MJ?
Yeah, I think it was.
Yeah. But that's, here's another fellow that we ought to look at because we're being sold a bill of goods. There was no mention, as we said before, of the Californian at all. The story of the Californian, another ship owned by J.P. Morgan, which did not respond to the flares. And some people say, well, they were white flares and they should have been red. But reality is, anytime that you're going to see flares in a dangerous situation like that, they should have at least woken up the wireless operator and said, make sure that this ship over there is okay, or let's find out what's going on. And so these sailors did not report anything. The captain, lord of the Californian, did not respond. And, this controversy went on for so long that even until James Cameron was ready to release his film in the late 90s, there were still lawsuits against the Californian incident because people were still trying to settle issues as to whether Captain Lord, Stanley Lord of the Californian was completely negligent and not doing anything to respond to the Titanic. I think he was. I think there was more to it than just negligence. Again, it's like we said before, Bob, it always looks like, somebody made a mistake, and the reality is there isn't room for as many mistakes as we saw here.
Not that many.
Well, who's to say that they made the mistake of firing off the wrong flares?
That's exactly right.
All you need is one schmuck with access to the flares that's in on it.
And there you go. All right,
flares, white ones.
Let's pick that up when we get back for the final segment. Fascinating show. MJ, thank you very much for the call. We'll have to dig deeper into that, so thank you. All right, folks, we'll be right back with the final segment. This is the Bob Tuskin Show. It's the final segment of the Bob Tuskin Show. Man, I'm glad we have calls sometimes. That was pretty fascinating. Just when I thought we were really digging deep and exposing the Titanic scam.
Yeah, I have to honestly say I'd never heard that, Bob, and that actually does explain a lot about what could have happened and how the ship broke apart and why it would have busted in two pieces like that.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff. We talk about the Jesuit connection with the Titanic, and maybe our friend Greg Zizmansky wants to comment on the Jesuit connection with the Titanic. Greg, care to comment? We're on the air talking about the Titanic tonight with our friends Steve Allen, Steve Stars, and Popeye from FederalJack.com. Yeah, maybe not. Maybe we'll just keep moving on and going on with the talk here about what exactly took place with the Titanic. A show of Titanic proportions, and it really has been. And fascinating call just before the break. We heard from a caller out there that was telling us about the fact that there was evidence that the ship was blown up. And I was joking in a prior segment about, thermite being used. But maybe there's some validity to, not thermite per se, but the fact that it was blown up. Interesting take on this. Popeye, I want to give you a chance to wrap up with your final comments on the Titanic, and then I'll let Steve wrap up as well. It's our final segment of the show, and I want to give time for us to really flesh into that.
Well, it's as simple as they've done it before. This kind of thing is not something new. 9/11 is not something new. The thought of them killing hundreds or thousands of innocent people is not new. They don't care about collateral damage. And, you know, a lot of these guys' fortune ended up being gobbled up by the Rockefellers and, you know, J.P. Morgan and other associates, and that helped fund World War II, or excuse me, World War I, which, you know, evidently World War II shouldn't even be called World War II. It should just be called World War I continued, okay? But because there really wasn't ever, you know, a peace treaty or anything. But that's a different show in itself. The point is, this stuff, history as we know it nowadays, could not have happened if these three men were not killed. It's as simple as that. And they were set up to be killed. What better way to take out your competition than to fool them into thinking, I mean, even fooling them, that's the best part. That's the best part of the con, is fooling them into even thinking that they're dying in some sort of quote-unquote natural disaster. So that way they never, you know, these people, this is the stuff these people think about. They're not incompetent like they pretend to be. They think 40, 50 years in advance. So these are the kind of things they think about. What better of a way to even fool the person than to think it's a natural disaster, so they don't say to one of their maids or their wife, you know, the Morgans did this or the Rockefellers did this, so there's no dying quote from the man. Okay, you know, their quotes are of bravery and stuff. Instead of, you never hear them say, "Oh, the Morgans did this." So, what better way to actually fool the people you're killing into thinking they're dying in some sort of freak natural disaster? And it even fools the world, obviously, because you can hide their murder. Oh, the ship sunk. Oh, they died. Oh, what a natural disaster. Oh, how sad. But we're going to steal all their money behind the scenes, and we're going to help it. We're going to use it to help us create the formation of a Federal Reserve System, a monster that has destroyed this country and raped the citizens for years and funded multiple wars and caused us to help push us for a new world order. And that's exactly what they did. So, I mean, you have to look at it like, yeah, I know sometimes people say, I hear this a lot, oh, you try to find conspiracies and everything. No, it's not. There's multiple conspiracies. I mean, if you could look at it that way.
What isn't a conspiracy is what my father says skeptically to me sometimes. He says, you think it's all a conspiracy. What isn't a conspiracy?
Well, I just tell them if you look at it like it's a grander agenda, it's not a conspiracy.
Let me ask you, Popeye, do you think that the fact that men and women make babies together is a conspiracy too, huh?
Well, if you think about it, well, no, actually, a conspiracy is when two or more people get together to do something bad.
So it is a conspiracy. No way, not to make children. That's not bad.
Yeah, so that's not bad. But if you were going to make a child, like if you were two Satanists and you were trying to get together and make a child to, you know, bring back and try to embody the Antichrist, right. I guess you could consider that a conspiracy.
All right, well, I didn't mean to digress so much here. Let's because we're running low on time. For the sake of time, final thoughts on Titanic, and then let's get Steve's final thoughts.
Well, pretty much just it's important to pay attention to, you know, what happened, and history is always very important, like I said in the beginning of the show, because without understanding history, we're doomed to repeat it. So if these guys could pull off the Titanic, they pulled off 9/11, they've pulled off other things, they sunk the Lusitania, I mean, come on.
Right.
You know, it's time to wake up, people. They do stuff and they're capable of it.
I'm on the same page exactly with you, Popeye. I couldn't have said it better myself. And thanks for that. And we'll let you plug your show and the upcoming follow-up to this program that you're doing on your program tomorrow, following this show on this network. So don't go anywhere, folks. That should be great. On one of our affiliates, anyways. And Steve, final comments on the whole Titanic thing, and I thank you for all the work you've done putting together this show for us.
Oh, my pleasure, Bob, and thanks to both of you guys. FederalJack.com, you got a great story up there, and also on BobTuskin.com, we'll be running this up as well. My final thoughts are, Bob, look at the novel. You know, Futility, The Wreck of the Titan. Just Google Morgan Robertson, and here you see the entire story of the Titanic written in a novel 14 years before it happened. The ship is even called the same, Titan. That tells you everything right there. This was a planned disaster. And they just like we said before, they lured all of these very important people that they wanted to kill onto this death trap and took it down. That's the real story of the Titanic. Oh, but it can't be. Yes, that is the real story. Otherwise, it's way beyond coincidence, friends. I mean, it's just way beyond coincidence that this novel could have actually told you exactly what was going to happen 14 years before it happened. Morgan Robertson, Futility, The Wreck of the Titanic. Read it for yourself. You'll find out. I think you'd be very convinced if you're, it's not coincidence.
Was that a pen name, Steve? Was that actually a pen name? Or was that the guy's real name?
No, I think it was the guy's real name, Morgan Robertson. Morgan as in JP, Robertson as in Pat
That's
Robertson.
why I wondered if it was a pen name, because it was interesting that his name was Morgan.
Yeah, it was, isn't it? And that was really the issue right there. I think that you look at it, JP Morgan had a very big insurance policy on this. He used that money to, to bolster himself and to create the New World Order. That's what, it's all a plan, and they have, they win, lose, or draw, they take over and move on.
Steve, thanks so much, buddy. We're going to have the full article and follow-up to this show on the website. Steve Stars, ladies and gentlemen, and Popeye, of course, Down the Rabbit Hole, coming up tomorrow on the Orion Radio Network, Micro 1650 AM. Thanks, Popeye.
No problem, Bob. Thanks for having me on.